Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third and final seminar in my series on artificial intelligence in education law. The topic we've been discussing over the last few months, AI in education law, is at the intersection of two very transformative fields. So as AI reshapes how we teach or learn or do law or manage education, it raises a lot of critical legal questions. From safeguarding student data to ensuring that we've got equal access, AI's integration into education and its embedding at the moment into all layers of wider society. In this seminar, I'll talk about how this demands a careful balance between innovation and excitement and all of the cool sci-fi side of things, but also the safety and rights and responsibilities of all involved. So on the screen at the moment, there's just a number of the headlines that we've seen over the last few weeks and months. Some of these you'll recognise from the last few seminars that we have discussed, and others are new for you to be having a think about, including about regulation by the Council of Europe, what they're talking about, as well as a number of different concerns and thoughts across the sector and how it relates to young people in particular, as well as students and anybody accessing education. So I'm Alice de Coverley. I'm a barrister at Three Paper Buildings in London. I specialise in education, equality and public law, and I have a particular interest in how technology affects children and young people, particularly children with special educational needs. I am delighted to be joined by Craig Smith, who is a lecturer in law at the University of Salford. He's worked in higher education for over 10 years, ranging from roles such as law librarian and head of digital education. He's currently undergoing a doctorate in education and EdD with a focus on generative AI's impact on legal education. And he's also a recognised senior fellow of advanced HE higher education. So for those of us who've joined us throughout the series, thank you so much for your continued engagement. If this is your first session, don't worry, you'll be able to access the full series online. We are going to publish the recordings of all three seminars after today. These slides will be emailed to all attendees after the session as well. Please submit your questions in the Q&A box, which you'll find at the bottom of the chat, and we will have time, hopefully at the end of the seminar, to talk through those. But we hope that this final session provides you with both practical insights and thought-provoking questions about the evolving role and risks of AI in society, as well as specifically in the education field. So thank you so much, Craig, for being part of this important conversation. And let's get started. So the agenda for today is set out here. Just out of interest, the image on the right-hand side was generated by ChatGPT after I asked it to create a picture based on the agenda, and that's there on the right-hand side. I will be talking through. We'll be talking through the data used to train machines, how AI could cause discrimination, how it interacts with design and creativity, and also risks that are associated with disinformation, hallucination that may arise using AI. Also got a section on safeguarding, particularly safeguarding children and the impacts of AI on children and also on adults. We've got a section on banning and restricting and embracing AI within the education field. You'll hear from Craig about how it's being used and looked at within universities. We also look at AI being used at the moment as educators, carers, lawyers, therapists, and I put in there also local authority with a quick experiment of how local authorities could use AI or have part of their role replaced by AI, safely or not, we'll see. Then we also wanted to talk about singularity, technological singularity. And if you don't remember my definition of that from the first session, don't worry, we'll talk about it again. Then we'll cover briefly what are the gaps, what are the risks in terms of the gaps in regulation and rights that we have at the moment. My second session was with my colleague Faisal Azman, about the current legal framework that is in place, but this is more about the gaps. And then we end with some predictions for AI going forward, which will probably be laughed at by our children to say You had no idea what was coming, but we wanted to make some predictions none the same. So what I'll do now is introduce Craig. If you want to just speak about this one, I'll mute myself.
That's great. Thanks so much, Alice. I appreciate the invitation and the introduction. It's very kind. So I just wanted to start the session a little bit talking about the data that is used to train AI. Now, often in the research and the kind of literature, we use the kind of phrase of garbage in and garbage out. So we're talking a little bit about the types of quality of data and the large data sets we use to train these algorithms or these AI systems. So this can include generative AI, such as kind of Gemini, ChatGPT, or Copilot, for example. But the data that these companies have used to kind of train that AI is really important. And I know that we've touched upon this slightly before, Alice, but what's really important here is that the information that these kind of machines are trained on is vast. It's referred to as kind of big data, and often it's public access data. It's data that's freely available. For example, we're all potentially very guilty of putting lots of information on our social media, whatever platform that might be, and that may well mean that that data is kind of, out there in the world to be accessed. This creates some issues for us, particularly if we are training AI systems with data that is biased. So we see this, and we'll touch back on an example around recruitment. But if we are training, often we've seen examples in our history of where recruitment is perhaps gender biased or discriminatory and other kind of around the protected characteristics. And as a result, if we use this data to train AI systems, it's very difficult for us to expect an AI to kind of get it right. So as I said, kind of garbage in, then we're going to get garbage out. And we also see issues arise around intellectual property. So if we're taking the work of individuals, that is for creative work, and as I showed earlier, there's asking ChatGPT, for example, to create an image for us. There's a lot around here around what this means in terms of protecting kind of creative rights, which we'll touch upon as well. But the data here is particularly important.
We're going to talk about the potentially discriminatory aspects of AI. It's clear from what Craig has said that there are some limits within the current tools that we have, and certain models have been prone to generating factually incorrect content, inappropriate content, biased content as well. And so it's really interesting to see how both what's going into the machine and also what's being generated by the machine may be having a discriminatory effect or impact, or perpetuating discriminatory views or cultural stereotypes about particular groups. So on this slide, I've talked about the different types of things that I'm seeing within AI at the moment. And it is not to say in the binary sense that AI is discriminatory, but it has a risk of being so, based on the fact that it's using human data, and some humans can have discriminatory views. And also because this is, I don't know how you would describe it, Craig, but it's a robot as well. So it's going to be following a different type of approach and pattern to things, and it may result in a discriminatory outcome. We've got an example of that coming up. But we can see within here that there are some risks in terms of bias in algorithms, and the fact that AI systems can be at risk of perpetuating and amplifying existing biases, so gender, sexual, racial, and socioeconomic biases in historical data. We've also seen, really interestingly, some gender stereotyping in the tech itself. So if you think about the tech that you have in your home or that you use on an everyday basis, you might have an Alexa, you might use Siri, you might use Concerta, for example. I think it's called that, whichever one comes with Microsoft. The interesting thing about this is that these are female personas, at least, or have female names. So Alexa, Siri, female leaning names. And so there is an argument that there's a kind of subservient or caring or emotional stereotype that's being associated with the model that's being used. And what we have seen has been for a number of years is that humans tend to associate caregiving or support giving bots as being female. And it is also interesting how those who are creating bots, including, and I put here, sex bots, are interestingly, more often than not, creating female-like bots, which raises some questions about subservience and also about why it is that we are seeing that tendency. Now, not always the case, of course. Many bots are neutral and have nothing like obvious like associated with it, but it is a slant that I think is important to keep an eye on. We've also seen concerns raised in those who are practicing in policing law or about surveillance or data protection or about facial recognition software and how this can have errors when it's looking at identifying women or people of colour. And there could be some discriminatory surveillance that's used, and policing practices need to make sure that they are keeping up properly with the technology as well as feeding the right information into that. There's also concerns about discriminatory health outcomes. So in the same way as we're using the data that already exists to build the model, the language, large language models, for example, to ascertain the issue that's going on. That's going to be limited by the amount of research that there is in that particular field. So if you are, for example, going to a doctor as a woman, you might find that the research about the pain or suffering that you're experiencing is limited because the research that's been done on women who experience that particular condition is less. So there's a number of different authors who've written about this over the last couple of years. And so because of that, you may then find that the output that is coming through the machine is going to be narrow and more limited and not give a full service to everyone who is accessing it because of that underrepresentation anyway in existing medical research at the moment. There's also on this list concerned about the discriminatory potentially impacts on anybody with a disability, or also I would add those who are less able to access technology through socioeconomic factors or through other barriers as well. So at the bottom, I've said, beware the discriminatory impacts of AI itself and of using AI.
And Alice, forgive me if I may just build upon so because these are great points, and particularly around the gender stereotyping. You mentioned about the names there as well. It's often the voices by default are around kind of female gender or kind of the flexibility to be able to tailor some of these tools to our own preferences as well allows for lots of choice, but the defaults often come in with that kind of defaulted name and defaulted kind of voice. So I think that's really kind of reinforcing some of the things you were talking about. And indeed, when we talk about the facial recognition, what's really interesting for me is when you talk about the kind of police use, is that often policing here is described as policing with consent. And we talk about the public's kind of awareness and consent to policing. And actually, a lot of the time, the facial recognition occurs without our knowledge in terms of where we may go, where we may assemble. Big events such as kind of the facial recognition used at music events or used in the kind of coronation with the king, and the idea around the police have used these tools obviously for security, and that makes sense, but actually around the potential unawareness of the public about to what extent this technology really collects biometric data, our kind of photos of our face, and how that is used is really important. So yeah, I think there's a lot there to kind of unpack, but you can see how it impacts us on our kind of everyday life. So it's really interesting.
So over the page, we have a section on algorithms and bias. So in the right-hand corner, you may recognize the masks, but also the point about during the pandemic in the first seminar, I touched upon the shift in the use of technology in schools and universities with remote access learning and Google Classroom becoming the norm, and this revealing inequalities with technology. So some children being without laptops, children with disabilities not having reasonable adjustments to aid them to use the technology that was being used at home. But as well as that, you may recall that we talked about the use of predictive technologies to determine exam results during COVID-19, resulting in unfairness and some discrimination. And if you recall the algorithm used by Ofqual to determine the grades for children who weren't able to sit exams because of the pandemic, relied on three inputs. So the historical grade distribution of a school, the rank of a child within the school for that particular subject, and the school's previous exam results. And so that meant that, for example, if nobody at the school had previously received an A grade in further maths, it was extremely unlikely to be possible that a student who was being entered for A-level maths during this over time using this algorithm could then be given an A grade that year, even if that child was really, really good at maths and very likely to get a maths A grade. And so, following a threat of legal action, so I was instructed on that judicial review, the government retracted this and reverted to accepting the teacher assessed grade. So that's an example of how algorithms can be poorly used, if not carefully, without advice from proper statisticians, and looking at, as well as that, the impact or the discriminatory, unexpectedly sometimes discriminatory effects of that particular machine. So Craig, I wanted to ask you about this and about what you might think when you see patterns in the data when none exist.
Yeah, I think it's a really good example, and actually is about the fact that actually I assume the intention wasn't to do this from the start. It's about using an algorithm to help, create a kind of accurate prediction with the information that is at hand. But, as you describe it, there are patterns that we perhaps don't perceive when we initially look at the limited amount of data that we can process as humans. And then actually what we find is that there is some bias in there. There is some machine learning, or kind of the ability of an algorithm to not have enough data to be able to make the decision that we want it to make fairly. And I think it comes back to this level of the big data that we have, the amount of data that we have, and the quality of that data, and actually if what the aim is that we're trying to get the kind of algorithm to do. So yeah, I think it kind of ties right back to the start of where we were discussing the kind of quality of data there. Absolutely.
All right. So next up, Craig, I know you wanted to talk about how this is impacting recruitment, because this will be interesting for anybody who's recruiting within schools and universities as well. So, Craig, what did you want to say about recruitment and selection with AI?
Yeah, I think it builds on your example of algorithmic use particularly, but we kind of all want this, as it's described there, this holy grail of being able to say, well, we have a huge number of applications. If you're employing someone, particularly in a big institution or an education establishment, local authority, whatever it might be, often you get a number of application forms, CVs, resumes, whatever that process might be. And here we've used the quote of kind of 100 that have come in. And essentially you don't really want to have to spend all that time working through them to be able to whittle it down to the top 10 or top 5. But that is, of course, the process. So there are easy solutions to this, but they're not potentially the right solution, which is that we employ an algorithm to help us kind of reduce this application down to a more manageable number. And that here is a kind of round selections or recruitment aids. And here, we want to get this 100 resumes down to about 5 or 10. And we'll work through with them and interview and take to the next stage, whatever that might be. Now, there's an example of this that I want to touch upon, which is from Amazon. And here it's from 2018, but we've put the link in the slides so you can access to have a look. But Amazon used a system to do exactly this, to kind of aid it in its selection and recruitment process. And in doing this, the system, the kind of algorithmic system, almost taught itself in the data that it had access to. It recognized a pattern. And that pattern was that Amazon employed more male candidates than it did female candidates. And as a result, it started to profile some of the applications that it had. Now, to be clear, Amazon edited this algorithm by removing it in an attempt to make it neutral by saying, well, don't consider this characteristic, don't consider gender, for example, and therefore we hope that that will result in a kind of fair outcome because there's no you're not considering this characteristic. But actually what the algorithm did was build a profile on individuals. So it understood that if you were part of the women's chess club, then that you were profiled to be a woman, and if you were the captain of the women's basketball team, that you then again would fit the profile of what this is. And actually, to what extent it did that, it's very difficult for us to ever fully understand. That kind of explainability in AI is really hard. And so Amazon stopped using it, to be clear, and were very clear to say that they didn't use it in a kind of live form. But there is the report from Reuters there that you can kind of look at. But it's an example of how even big tech companies that have the specialisms to be able to try and the technical skill to be able to do this still struggle with exactly how to implement some of these recruitment tools, generally based on the data that the algorithm has access to.
So frightening in a way, isn't it? Thinking about how many things are being decided without our full understanding.
Mm.
I know that we spoke in the past about black box and glass box, and the analogy there with the way in which these machines are making decisions. So, just for our audience, could you just explain those two things?
Yeah. So often what we have is this technology that makes a decision for us. And that may be a decision about me, for example, that I kind of apply for, a job or a loan or something, and a decision is made for me by an algorithm or by a form, an AI, in our kind of interpretation of the term. And I'm not entirely sure how that AI made that decision. And we refer to that kind of box as the kind of black box. I can't see how that happened. I kind of put in my application and an output came out, and I don't fully understand it. And it reminds me of kind of GCSE maths where you get points and marks for explaining your answer, not just getting the answer at the end. So it kind of goes back to our fundamental principles around education. But the literature talks around, and actually a lot of the kind of section I was talking about, explainable AI, that we want an AI to explain to either the developer or the user or the kind of company that uses it around how it's made this decision and maybe some explainable points around, well, I took in these factors and I considered this, and that means that we've come to this outcome. And that we kind of use the analogy around being able to see into the kind of box and almost the brain of the AI and understand more about exactly how it's made that decision. So away from this idea of black box into glass box.
Okay, so next up, we had a bit of a slide on design, creativity, arts, and writing, and how AI is affecting that, which will be interesting for anybody who's administering GCSE arts or doing a fine art degrees or anything like that in the kind of creative arts education as well. So, Craig, what did you want to tell everyone about the robot that's talked about on here?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating that we see the kind of, the House of Lords particularly taking a kind of step in this direction to understand more. And the way in which they've done that is to almost call a robot to the Lords and ask it questions about what it does and how it contributes creatively and to the arts and what that might mean. And the example used here is Ada, and Ada gave kind of evidence or kind of spoke at the House of Lords in 2022. And it spoke about the kind of future of arts design, fashion, and sounds really interesting around what it does. But what I thought was fascinating by its speech there is that Ada, again, in terms of a kind of gender, is an example of a kind of more leaning towards a female gender personification, and actually talking around the fact that Ada describes viewing through a kind of almost through an eye, but kind of cameras and explaining how the process works and how Ada creates art and very describing a kind of mechanism way of artistry or painting or poems or writing or whatever it might be. And actually, the Lord's really interested in terms of that conversation about how the law particularly deals with creativity, and we've always dealt with creativity as a kind of person-centric expression of craft and expression of emotion and idea, and that it's a natural person when we consider it under the law, and all these aspects and how we turn to creativity as a field with AI, particularly in a robot example, is quite jarring for us, and it's quite hard for us to kind of wrap our minds round. And I think here as well, what we've seen, oh, I've just lost the slide, sorry, thank you, is that we talk a little bit about the idea of in the classroom what this means. And the example you used of the image before, Alice, immediately I'm like, oh yeah, I can kind of tell it's ChatGPT. It just has that style and that kind of, it's almost creating its own genre of creativity. And there are some really interesting cases about what this will mean, because recently on social media, many of you may have seen the kind of Disney and Pixar-esque type themed images, and like, oh, if you change, AI can change this film that's nothing to do with this kind of company or aspect, but and make it look like a Pixar or Disney photo. And obviously there's some action around Disney there in terms of it doesn't want that. It doesn't like the idea of its kind of creativity field and its kind of trademark kind of look being considered. So yeah, it is pushing the boundaries, I think, of what we might understand this to be.
I understand that I'm a little quieter than Craig, so I'm just going to try and keep my voice up, but please let me know. I've tried to disconnect something just to see if it would make my voice a bit louder. Please do shout if it's still quiet, and I'll just get Craig to talk instead of me. The next slide was all about disinformation and hallucinations. So if you remember, we talked about hallucinations, which are the things that were created by, for example, ChatGPT, that are nonsense or inaccuracies or fake news that kind of come out and are made up. And sometimes they can go completely wild with what output they produce that's nothing to do with what you've said. Sort of like a glitch in the matrix of what a glitch in what the output is going to be. So what Craig talked about here as well, black box AI versus glass box, that we've already discussed. But it's just really important to emphasize that when we're using these models, that we can see that there are some examples, many examples of where it's been used in a way without human checking. And if you remember in the second session, we talked about the way in which the civil service has got a mechanism for the checking before, during, and after the use of the app or the model, to make sure that you are sure that the information that's being produced is accurate. A prompt that some of my colleagues have used with ChatGPT is to say to it, please produce accurate and true, 100% true information. But then, even then, it's creating cases that are made up. So I would rely on Lexis AI or something like an actual legal product instead of a generic LLM for that. So, Craig, what do you think?
I was gonna say, and I think now it's become almost comical in that when we do find obvious hallucinations, that we kind of share them online to say, "Oh, look what this has done! How silly is it?" And that's quite interesting in that we can easily recognize, and it's almost a form of the kind of Turing test to be able to understand that this is silly technology. The kind of we understand it to be, but at the same time quite powerful, and that it can really help us, and there is reasons we use it a lot. But it is that kind of nonsensical aspect that can sometimes, when we see images of lots of fingers on humans, and we're like, well, clearly created by an AI, it struggled with the idea of how many fingers we have, and so kind of classic examples of it. But really, obviously, as you described, we see problems with this with the information. So it can have really huge, significant impact, particularly when it's dealing with the ability of people using it in a confident way. I believe this technology, and actually it's giving me information that is incorrect, inaccurate. And as a result, we need to apply that kind of critical and quality aspect of human thinking to ensure that we do double check what it is we're kind of working with. So yeah, I mean, as I said, if it explained itself, then perhaps we would feel more confident with it.
So, for many of you working in education law, safeguarding will be a very important part of what you do. So, I wanted to talk on this slide about the way in which safeguarding needs to be thought about when we're looking at use of AI by children and young people, but also by schools and by educators, by anybody in society at all. And really, the fact that there is a lot to say about safeguarding reflects, I think, what the UK is currently grappling with, which is the safety of AI versus the innovation and the future and the exciting parts of it, which was epitomised, I think, by the fact that they have been involved in international seminars on AI safety as one of the main things that have been happening over the last 12 months and will be happening next year as well. And so in this slide, I've included a number of different news articles about this at the moment. I'm just checking that I sound clear now, I think. Good. Okay. I'm just checking that there was ability to hear me, but it sounds like this. So on this, I've included some news reports where I was looking at safeguarding and how it arises in issues about AI. And for example, at the very top on the right hand side, you can see that there was recently a man who used AI to create child sexual abuse images. And the current legal framework allowed in this country for him to be prosecuted for sexual offences, even though the content didn't involve a real child as such, on the basis that it still met, he was still able to be charged and sentenced for and convicted and sentenced for those offences. And this follows a pattern of other people in America also being prosecuted for the same thing. So there's a quite clear message that this is also unlawful. But it shows you quite frighteningly what the capabilities are of the image generation that exists. And although I showed a picture about what ChatGPT can produce, which was that sort of more comical, very soft lines, all very similar style, you can tell that it's from ChatGPT. Other apps like Midjourney, DALL-E can create extremely lifelike and real content that is sometimes now indistinguishable from reality. And AI is getting better and better at creating hands, was one of the things they could do, but also creating things that don't have a sort of Photoshop sheen. Before, I would say in the last year, lots of the images that we used to build the database of images that then could be copied and created into something new were based on models and the sort of I suppose more beautiful people. And so the results were often very aesthetically pleasing, beautiful images of people that were created. Now the data pool is so big that there's all different diversity of people and pictures and everything. It's sweeping and taking everything from everywhere. So you can create an image of somebody sitting in a hot tub in the 1980s with a picture of you and your friend, and it will look like something that is real. There'll be something potentially slightly off about it that gives you a funny feeling about whether or not it is real, but not always. And there's a huge amount that you'll see now more on your social media timelines and in news reports and so on, where it's not clear what the reality is and whether or not it is in fact a real image. And that's creating some real problems, I think, with how we perceive those images. For example, you may recall that there were those horrible floods in Spain, which caused the deaths of 200, 300 people. And a number of the images and the videos of what came out from that, you may recall there was a video of the cars being swept away in the river, in what looked like a river down the street. And there was a bit of a flurry online about whether or not this was in fact real, because it was such a disastrous scene that you may imagine in a disaster movie. And that is the sort of thing that the AI can create now, are videos that are like that. That there was a confusion about what was real and what was not real. And actually that was real, but it made people doubt that it was. And then that can result in a lot of problems with believing that people have been harmed, etc., etc. So you can see how that would have some problems. And one of the top things at this slide is about pursuit of profit over safety. So one of the things that we're seeing is, well, many things we're seeing is about companies pursuing profit at the expense of safety of the users. So the green on the bottom right hand side, and this relates to the seeing of harmful content. You may remember the young person, Molly Russell, who was 14, who died in 2017 after viewing harmful content related to suicide and self-harm on social media platforms. And a coroner at an inquest later concluded that the content which was recommended to her by her social media algorithm, on Instagram in particular, contributed significantly to her death. And the coroner's report highlighted that Molly had been exposed to content promoting self-harm, suicide and distressing imagery, which she'd accessed via social media. but the important thing was that this was generated by the algorithm, and because she was hovering over it, because it was appealing to her in her dark moments, it was staying there, and then it was producing more and more, and she continued to see that same type of content rather than moving off to a different route. And this case underscored those risks posed by AI-driven algorithms, particularly when they inadvertently or even deliberately, in pursuit of profit, to keep you hooked, to keep you watching your phone, keeping you on TikTok, to amplify this harmful content. And this is, I think, going to spark and continue discussions about the need for more robust safeguards and regulation in digital spaces. And this led to the Online Safety Bill that is the Safety Act, which is now in place, which puts more accountability on big tech companies. And now there are teen accounts for Instagram. So, but greater than that, we're also seeing some concerns about the impact on children and young people, depending on the extent to which more broadly technology is integrated into lives. So I'm very much not a proponent of banning technology completely for children. I think there's a huge amount of benefit to them. But what we can see that there are some concerns being raised about how AI may reduce interaction with peers or with educators, with adults. We'll come to that in a moment when we're talking about educators. It might expose them to harmful content, and it might exacerbate and expose greater risk when it comes to feeding addiction, loneliness, isolation, lack of meaningful communications. We can also see that there are concerns about data. So Craig already touched on this, but the amount of sensitive data that education institutions are collecting, academic records, behavior, AI systems may need access to that to help assist with various tasks, seeing patterns in the data and so on. That's a good thing. It's a helpful thing for plotting, for example, where there are an increase in exclusions or suspensions for a particular behavior. But it also results in a huge amount of risk in relation to data breaches or even the misuse of data for surveillance purposes as well. In this list too, you can see that there is a concern about impact on critical thinking or on cognitive skills. So the ability of generative AI like ChatGPT to produce really realistic written content is sparking concerns about students using it to complete coursework, exams, assessments, and so on. There are AI detection tools that many educators are using, but those are also limited. So it can make it quite challenging to detect its use in student work. But also more broadly than that, some experts have raised concerns about AI reducing students' ability to solve problems independently, hinder the development of certain skills. It might prevent children and young people from actually doing the work because they're just putting it in. Now, that's a pretty extreme thought. I think there's a more balanced way of looking at it, which we'll come on to. But there is a concern about the inhibition on learning if it allows you to automate all of your education output without any critical thinking skills. So I think when it comes to safeguarding and all of the issues that are raised on this page and more, a large amount of the issue relates to the uncertainty and unpredictability around AI. So we know that ChatGPT gained mainstream attention last year, only produced at the end of 2022. And its full integration and its full impact is still unfolding. Some schools are banning it, some are unaware of it, some are not restricting it at all. I think there's still quite a lot of catch up about it that's happening. A lot of it's still quite experimental, and it's not yet got really any reliable. There are some papers about it. There's not a massive amount of reliable evidence about the wide scale adoption of generative AI in education, which I think is which is interesting. So, Craig, from a safeguarding perspective, are you seeing anything in the higher education sector that is dealing with this technology and how it's affecting students?
A little bit, yeah. So particularly around what you're saying in terms of almost around intervention. So for you, big institutions, universities, or kind of other educational establishments, we do hold a lot of data about students that we teach and work with, and as a result, it does mean that we have become, or the sector has become, kind of better at understanding patterns and therefore saying, oh, we perhaps should intervene here or contact or kind of do something with this individual, particularly as the environments change, obviously, as you go through kind of, primary, secondary, tertiary education. And so depending on your environment, it can mean a different kind of outcome. But yeah, I think that's important between the kind of the way in which institutions may use their data and to be mindful of exactly how you do use that data and if that's transparent. But equally for individuals, for students who use this, I think the point around the critical thinking and kind of cognitive skills, I liken this example to if anybody drives to work, for example, you most likely navigate using an app like Google Maps. Now, that's most likely because you want the traffic data, or if a road closes, it can direct you and it's convenient. And as a result of that, we've lessened our ability to remember the road names and the alternative routes in, and and our skill in navigation is almost replaced by an AI, and therefore I don't need to know the fact that that's an A road and the road's called this because it just directs me. And so, it's an example of my skill in navigation not being what generations before me probably had when they had, they knew, yeah, that road over there and that's on the map. And so, our ability for critical thinking and cognitive will diminish if we become reliant on this technology. So in terms of a safeguarding aspect there, it's very hard. It's almost difficult to grasp and identify and tackle. So absolutely. But I'll touch a little bit about the AI detectors, maybe later on and kind of how we tackle that with assessments at university as well. Yeah. So actually, this is a great point in our kind of next slide. Perfectly, kind of leads us into around banning this. And actually, someone once described this. It's almost like trying to ban water on campus. It's very difficult to, restrict access to AI here, and schools and universities have had quite, or the first initial reaction was quite diminishing, or kind of, well, let's not worry, or let's outright ban it, or let's tackle this as an issue. And I think we're starting to come round to the idea now of embracing it a little bit more. But there are, of course, risks around banning AI. AI is used in a lot of sectors and a lot of professions. And if my role as a lecturer is to help prepare graduates for the kind of future of their profession, particularly law and legal profession, then it seems wrong of me to not include AI in that education and in that curricula for that student. Particularly if they're going to go on and use it. I would like the first time that they use that in a kind of professional environment to be with me at university rather than perhaps in the office. And so we've seen, encouraging students to use this in their essays. That's certainly my stance, that I take a more broader approach of you are entitled and encouraged to use these types of technologies, maybe in more of an assistive way to help you with structuring or to help you with kind of ideas and thinking more critically about, if I write this, can I expand on that? How might I shorten this? How might I write more concisely? And I think those types of uses have already been used and developed quite well with students who have neurodiversity. They are used to using these types of technologies, perhaps not generative AI tools, but other types of technologies that are assistive. And so they have quite a lot of skill in sharing that in the kind of seminar groups with us around how they may use it. I'm thinking of tools like Grammarly, for example, and other types that perhaps that don't fall neatly into the box of AI. The big issue I have with this is that I expect transparency. If students are going to use this, they must declare it. It is different to a student who has not used it. And so they need to be honest, they need to be open and professional about the way in which they have used such tools in their academic assessment. And I can use AI detector tools, but they often pull back false positives. They're often not as accurate as perhaps they often claim to be. I dislike sometimes sharing any sort of data externally. So if it's not one that's kind of approved by the institution, I won't use it. But there are of issues around data sharing as well with these types of technologies if they're third parties. And so it is hard to embrace AI. Not everyone has the kind of space to do it, but I think an outright ban is too difficult. I think it's also detrimental to the skill and the kind of area around education that we want to achieve, the aim, which is to educate and teach. But I understand fully that even universities, schools are still kind of wrestling with exactly what this looks like.
Would you agree that one of the main things that educators need to deal with is teaching students how to use it and being taught, knowing how to use it, because AI is here to stay. We have to deal with it, and it's important that people know how to use the technology.
Yeah, and I think that is a social constructivism way as well. It can't be done in a kind of here's how you should use AI, only use it in this limited way. I think it has to be much more of a social conversation to be about how do you use AI? What is your experience of using it? Am I learning as an educator about the way in which you as students are using this? And why is it that you use it in that way? Is it to develop a skill? Is it to make life more convenient? Is it an unethical use that perhaps is a worry for me, and or kind of, is it a creative use? So, and as a result of all of that, I think it means that we get a perception on the societal use of AI. So, yeah, here we see on slide a kind of a few examples that we're kind of going to explore where we see AI as this role as an educator, this role as a carer, a therapist, even a lawyer. So yeah, lots there to look at. Another great image.
Yes, created. You can tell it's created by ChatGPT. It's the one that's meant to be a therapist. I don't know why the therapist is dressed in this blanket in that
Yeah.
way. That's what created. And also, if you look really carefully, you can see quite a creepy, weird baby in the bookcase. Don't know
Yes.
why that's come from, but it shows you what sort of weird stuff ChatGPT can produce, as well as some quite cool images I thought of the lawyer. But there we go. So, right, we wanted to talk to you about what is happening in different sectors. So we'll focus. There are a number of other sectors that we're talking about, like law and carers, and as I say, EHP generation as well. Because of the time, I think we'll focus on educational. We'll go a little bit more quickly through the other ones that are less about education. So, Craig, what did you want to tell everyone about AI educators?
Yeah, just briefly here, I wanted to particularly pull the article here that says AI head teacher appointed to UK boarding school. So this is an example where I think it's Abigail Bailey is the name of the AI chatbot that is the assistant head teacher to the head teacher, Mr. Rogerson here, I think it is. And the idea that our children and our students are kind of not necessarily just exposed to AI, but they are kind of seeing AI as an integral part of the educational process and as part of a chatbot where they can ask, for help, and that the perception of what they expect a head teacher to be is then manifested in this kind of assisted chatbot role, and what that means for us in terms of ethical applications and indeed our children's perception of how they communicate with technology, I think is really interesting. So yeah, I just wanted to touch upon that one at least. Thanks, Alice.
And some of you who work in home education or EOTAS, EOTIS, education otherwise than in school type cases may have come across a robot that's being rolled out by some schools and local authorities to teach children from home, where they can live stream into the classroom, but they have a robot that is checking whether or not the kid is paying attention, has some reciprocity with the child, and it isn't providing any teaching. It's more of a monitoring type focus, but it's certainly being rolled out as a temporary, meant to be a temporary replacement for teaching to meet a local authority section 19 education act duties. So whether that is suitable full-time education or not, I think will probably be the subject of quite an interesting judicial review sooner rather than later. On carers, I put
Yes.
Megan, the film in the corner that some of you may have seen. And Craig, you wanted to just mention this YouTube piece about that from Dr. James White.
Yes, thank you. Just briefly, forgive me, I appreciate time. Is that again, we see solutions to crises in care here described particularly through a kind of example of Japan. So Dr. James Wright, yeah, at the University of Oxford, there's a lecture there that you, if you're interested, can watch. But the idea that we see robots or AI used to tackle a problem here, particularly with our kind of for elder care or social care, and how that may be seen in future with kind of robot care with children or parental care, or how we have it's very expensive to have nurseries, or kind of whatever it might be in terms of the safeguarding around these aspects. But there's a real kind of demonstration, I think, between what's happening in our kind of world in the UK and in Japan to what the media and Hollywood kind of perceive may well happen in the kind of film of Megan, where this kind of child companion doll goes a little bit rogue. But the idea there of that robot that can really show us the kind of example of where this may go wrong, I think is really powerful. So yeah, I just wanted to make a point there about how we do see AI in social care, particularly around elder care as well. Yeah. Thank you.
Wanted to mention therapy as well. So something I was thinking about in preparing for this was how many of my friends use ChatGPT or other Claude, other more emotionally literate language um, models. Trying to think of some others, um, where they're getting some therapeutic value from it. Lots of these are being trained on CBT and trained to understand different neurodivergencies and different mental health conditions, as well as more wider use across diagnostic work. I'm seeing it, interestingly, being used by the NHS now. So on the right hand side, you can see that their chatbot is being used in, I think it's Surrey, to streamline mental health referrals. So it will triage the initial mental health referral through this app called Limbic Access, which is apparently an award-winning app. And the feedback is positive insofar as it says things like, it was really nice to feel heard, even though it was a robot. I think that raises some really interesting ethical and legal issues about to what extent is that triaging going to do its job? Is it better than young people and adults waiting for months, if not years, for proper support? We all know the problems with CAMS, with getting fast and effective mental health support, particularly even in a crisis. Is this going to alleviate pressures on the NHS and help with some of the backlog? Probably it will. But are we going to see some worrying repercussions of this, where there are limits to the app, where it doesn't pick up on proper issues, where the user just wants to talk to a person, and actually speaking to a robot is like another door in their face? I think it's got some really interesting risks as well as benefits to it. But I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see this rolled out more broadly. We see it with NHS GP appointments already. I used it to get antibiotics recently by talking to a bot about my symptoms, for example. Is that going to be more helpful, or is it going to miss something important in what I've explained? I don't know. I don't know what's going on behind the scenes in that technology, but it can also feel depersonalized. So the AI therapist is certainly very interesting, and maybe we'll see that in some EHC plans for children. We might see it used by schools, not as a replacement, but certainly as a tool and as a way of reducing the resource burden on schools and other institutions. You had a couple of articles here, Craig, one from The Guardian in particular. You just wanted to pick
Yeah,
out.
just describing the kind of reinforcing really your description before about just speaking to somebody. It's cheap, it's quick, it's available, it's 24/7. It's, how can anyone compete with that as a human service? It's very hard to deliver that. And so to some extent, again, with the NHS and education resourcing, it's difficult. But actually, to some extent, this may well be an intervention that can help when it's out of hours, particularly. So, it will be interesting to see how this develops. But as it develops, we'll see kind of as we move forward now about how this, we have some concerns, I think, about how people who are vulnerable use these types of bots. So here we use the case example of the kind of castle intruder who pleads guilty to threatening to kill Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. And so this is a case of treason. And the individual, the defendant here who trespassed on the grounds was 21. and was arrested on, you may remember, on Christmas Day, I think it was in 2021. So I think this may have occurred Christmas Eve. It was kind of on the news that year. So if your memory serves you, you may well remember it. And he'd recorded some videos about how this was going to happen, and kind of left a kind of trail of evidence digitally about what was going to happen here. And the CPS link there about the kind of updated sentence is clear for us to look at. The reason I bring this case in is because this individual was communicating with a chatbot. And so we can start to understand where repercussions or effects of this kind of use, particularly with an individual who's considered vulnerable, can really have impact. So just taking some of the paragraphs from Mr. Justice Hilliard's sentencing remarks, we can see here that the defendant created an AI companion, and that was called Sahari, and that was using an app called Replica, and described it here as feeling like he was talking to a real person, how this was reinforcing some of the thoughts that the defendant had, and again interacting a lot with this AI app, and in this kind of negative mental state of mind, so around loneliness, depression, and giving that kind of vulnerable state of mind, was encouraged by this AI in to manipulate perhaps, or to change or influence the behavior of the individual. So Dr. Brown there talks about how it appears that encouragement was given by this AI chatbot, and the paragraph names numbers are at the end here, so you can see where we've taken this from, and demonstrating this interesting tendency we have when we use AI chatbots to attribute human characteristics to them. So right at the beginning of this, we talked about naming them, giving them voices, and this idea of attributing human characteristics. So again, maintaining that ability to kind of recognize that it is an AI, it is a chatbot, but that we kind of like to personalize and have that human aspect. So demonstrating here the real impact that using an AI chatbot can have.
So on this slide, there are links to more articles about how lawyers are using AI as well. So have a look at those when you receive the slides. I then wanted to, some of you will be dealing with children with their special educational needs and local authority EHCP education, health and care plans that are generated. And I put in this slide the instructions that are given to ChatGPT to create a auto-generated EHC plan. So if you imagine a model where you take all of the expert reports, put it into an app, and ask it to spit out an EHCP, how would it do it? And you can train it on the law, train it on the Children and Families Act, train it on the Equality Act, train it on all of the case law in the Noddy Guide, if you're aware of it, that relates to the specificity and the quantification of provision and so on. What could that produce? Could that produce an accurate enough EHC plan that is then just tweaked by local authority officers who are already dealing with hundreds of these cases and are getting behind on their regulation, on their timeframes that are set by regulations? So it's just a really interesting way of seeing, well, actually, this could be really helpful. It could also result in some quite significant problems that are dealt with by lawyers later, but it could reduce some of the inefficiency that we're seeing within local authorities if you were to build an app that would help to create an EHCP that is legally compliant and also captures properly the wishes and feelings of that child and their parents and all of the professionals that are there. Could that even go one step further and replace the tribunal at the end of it? I hope not. Pay my mortgage. So that's the AI generated EHC plans, just food for thought there. We had a slide or two about gaps in regulation and AI rights. It's something, Craig, I know we're at 12 o'clock. So you want to just touch on this briefly and then we'll
Yeah.
take questions from you.
Yeah, I know, I appreciate that we like to talk. But the yeah, particularly here around the example you've just given, if there's an issue with that, and where's the accountability lie? How do we kind of hold an AI responsible? To what extent might we achieve that? And here we talk about should we allow humans to disclaim all responsibility for the AI's action? Well, I told it what to do, I gave it the data. Am I allowed to take a step back and say that the AI did something, it produced something, it influenced someone? That's not on me. And so the accountability gap in this is really interesting, and how in future, if we are using robots in care examples, or as therapists or as lawyers, to what extent do we hold a legal entity for that for that kind of thing. We do this with companies, for example. Do we just copy the kind of same model there? And so it's a really interesting field legally from at least a theoretical perspective. I'm sure very few people agree with the term interesting, but it's something that I find myself reading a lot about. So yeah, thank you. And I kind of tie to iRobot as a great film to demonstrate that.
Wonderful. And so then turning to what we predict, as I said, I'm certain that my children will laugh at this and think in a couple of years, what on earth was I thinking? It's going to be completely unimaginable to what it ended up being. And those who were around and working in the early 90s may remember well, of course, will remember the way in which the World Wide Web was incredibly exciting when it resulted in a huge transformative technological shift. I think that AI is going to go one step further than even the internet did. I think it's going to more profoundly impact humankind and the way we think and the way that we interact in ways that are even more significant than what the internet was doing, which was largely about sharing information and about communication. And I think we will see it deployed across education into all levels. And I'll also expect, we're already seeing it on phones, on some phones now, but we'll see it as a common part of day-to-day consumer devices. Regulation, Craig, you had a view on regulation, to what extent that will become a global focus over the next year?
Yeah, I think particularly with obviously seeing the EU AI Act and their kind of ability to say, they've prohibited outright some types of AI around those that can influence behavior or impact our kind of perception of reality, the way in which we are kind of exposed to information as well through AI algorithmic use. So the EU rather taking a very kind of hard stance on that. But of course, it has to be kind of big global players that really take this forward. And there's this common perception around the kind of the US innovates and the EU regulates, and this idea around a global focus here will become more and more prevalent. So to what extent we kind of adopt that in kind of England, Wales, and the UK will be interesting. Yeah, definitely.
Finally, food for thought for those who have been with us through this journey talking about AI is about at what point will it take over? At what point will technology advance beyond what we can expect? So, in terms of the level of technological advancement, at what point will AI be able to generate AI? Well, it already can if you ask it to. But at what point will it be able to do that autonomously without human input? I think we're on the edge of that already. And there's also a question mark about AI consciousness and at what point, if any, it will be able to be divisible from the human brain. I think that's possibly a bit too sci-fi for a legal seminar. But within that diagram, you can see predictions about what point that will happen. And if you are interested in it, there's a huge amount of writing about technological singularity. Some say it's already been met. Some say it's by 2029. The author of where that image is from, Craig Bellamy, says 2029. I don't know where you think it might be, Craig.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point, isn't it? Particularly around AI creating AI, but yeah, in the future it will come. But also to what extent we start to augment ourselves with this. Like if I leave the house without my phone now, I will turn around and go and get it. It doesn't matter if I'm half an hour through my journey. And the idea that we start to augment ourselves with types of technology. So whether we become more connected with AI or whether AI surpasses us, yes, it will be interesting to see kind of how singularity itself develops. Yeah.
But thank you so much, Craig, for coming and being with us today to talk about this from a practitioner perspective in the field, as well as an expert in the field as well. So I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to say
Just
before.
Just thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a real privilege, Alice, and watching all three or watching the previous two and being part of this one has been great. So thank you so much. Appreciate it.
It was wonderful to have you. Take care. Thank you. Bye bye.